Welcome to the Faith and Feelings podcast. My name is Taylor Joy, and I'm passionate about helping you untangle and honor your emotions, authentically practice your faith, and integrate both into your everyday life so that you can experience the goodness and delight that comes from living in relationship with yourself, God, and others. Thank you for joining me. Let's get started. Sometimes suffering lasts, and where is God in this? How do we find joy, hope, and love when life becomes undone? These are two questions that I've sat with over the last 2 months as we've been in a series on the podcast called When Life Doesn't Make Sense. In John 16, Jesus says, "In this world, you will have trouble." So this series was formed around a question that I've been asking. If suffering is promised, what does it look like to suffer well? What does it look like to hold grief and joy, laughter and tears, wrestling and trust, grief and belief? When life doesn't make sense, we need a theology of suffering that helps us expand to hold the brokenness and beauty of our world together. In this series, I've hosted conversations with 8 different women about their stories of pain and sorrow and what they've been learning about hope, lament, joy, and courage when life gets really hard. My hope has been that these conversations offer words and phrases that capture the emotions of your heart and give voice to your pain. What I've loved most about these stories is how they've enfleshed the concept of a theology of suffering into lived experience. These stories have been full of laughter and tears. They've held humor and deep sorrow. Every single episode has been so rich, and I've been learning and reflecting on a lot. So in today's episode, I wanted to wrap up this series by sharing some of what I've been pondering in regards to a theology of suffering over the last few months. And for me, this started with reimagining who God is in the midst of it. Where is God when we get the phone call that we never expected? Where is God when we're reeling from a diagnosis that we never anticipated? Where is God in the addiction, the depression, the miscarriage, the abuse, the financial struggles, the loneliness, or the ongoing conflict? And in our moments of unraveling, what is God's posture towards us? What might be the expression on his face? What I've heard these 8 women describe over and over again is not a God who is far removed or distant. In almost every conversation, they've put words to their encounters with a God who draws near, who weeps. I've often thought of Luke 11, when in the face of his friend Lazarus dying, the gospel writer records a moment that Jesus wept. Those 2 words make up the shortest verse in the Bible, and they hold so much depth and meaning. They describe the heart of God. In the face of suffering that he never intended, death that he never wanted, and a life that no one around him could make sense of, he wept. Understanding this can bring a sense of presence and witness that we often don't experience because our default picture of God is not a God with tears on his face for us. One of the things I've been learning is that our response to suffering, the story we tell ourselves, the habits we engage to cope and make our way through, and the company we pull in or push away in the midst of it, profoundly influences what we believe and who we become. And the story we tell ourselves about our suffering usually doesn't involve a God who weeps. I've seen how suffering can be the very thing that drives us towards God. And I've seen how suffering can be the very thing that drives us away from Him. And the difference between those two responses can often be found in the story we're telling ourselves, the meaning that we give to our pain, and the interpretations that we conclude about who God is in the midst of it. Tyler Staton emphasizes that when suffering intrudes into our lives, it drives a wedge between our belief and our experience. And suddenly, the story we believe is very hard to square with the story that we find ourselves living. That can leave us feeling lost in precisely the place where we felt found. Naomi, whose story is recorded in the book of Ruth, is a woman who I believe knew this sense of disorientation and lostness well. If you don't know her story, the first few lines of the book alone speak to the life of sorrow that Naomi lived. After moving from Bethlehem to Moab because of a famine, Naomi's husband dies, followed by her 2 sons. 10 years after moving to Moab, she hears that the famine is over, so she decides to move back to Bethlehem. But one conversation that she has with her 2 daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah, stand out to me. While it was custom that Ruth and Orpah stay with Naomi and not return to their own families after the deaths of their husbands, Naomi tells them to stay in Moab rather than traveling with her to Bethlehem. But the words that she uses to describe her current circumstances hold layers of meaning. Listen to what she says, starting in verse 11. But Naomi replied, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you go with me? Are there still sons in my womb to become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. Go on, for I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was hope for me to have a husband tonight and to bear sons, would you wait for them to grow up? Would you refrain from having husbands? No, my daughters, it grieves me very much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." Naomi starts by simply recording the facts of her situation, but something shifts in that final sentence. She goes from facts to assumptions. She goes from merely recounting her life's events to interpreting the meaning of those events. She goes from her suffering to God's role in her suffering. The Lord's hand has turned against me. This is how she has made sense of who God is in her pain and sorrow, as a God who has turned away and who has made her life bitter. What Naomi does in this moment is a prime representation for what humans do when life doesn't make sense. We try to make sense of it. In our pain and wounding, we grasp for some kind of meaning. That question, why, is perhaps the most agonizing question of all. Why did that happen? When we can't make sense of life, we create a story to try to explain our pain. Living inside of a story that we can clearly define feels like the way to make our hurt survivable. These stories are not necessarily formed in our conscious awareness. Seeking order in chaos and answers in ambiguity is something that our brains are instinctually wired to do. But here's the problem. The stories that we make up often sound something like this. It's my fault. I'm the problem. They are wrong. God is against me. They narrow our gaze to see the world through a single lens, a lens clouded by blame and shame. When internalized, these stories and interpretations become our mental frameworks for understanding and engaging in life. And the emotional upheaval that they cause drives us towards dysfunctional behaviors. The stories that we create to make our pain bearable becomes the source of more confusion and pain and wounding. Those embedded beliefs of it's my fault or God is against me leak out into our lives in the form of all kinds of dysfunctional behaviors as a way to numb, to avoid thinking or feeling. They become a way of escaping the pain of uncertainty, but they keep us unaware of what's going on inside. But this isn't the heart of God for us. The God who weeps for us also longs to walk with us through every moment of life. He's always working, slowly weaving our lives together in ways that we can never fully see. And he is continually inviting us to allow him to widen our lens, expanding and stretching these narratives. He wants to give us a mental framework and belief system that's true, a meaning for our pain that connects us to the bigger story that he is telling with our lives. But this requires that we get close to our pain, that we feel it and hold it and name it. As one psychologist says, numbing is the opposite of naming. Over the last few months, I keep going back to this one small story in the gospel accounts. The story is found in Luke 24 and is often called the road to Emmaus. To briefly set some of the backdrop for this story, Jesus had just been crucified, and this story records two disciples of Jesus leaving Jerusalem to walk to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles away. I can only imagine the grief, the shock, and the confusion that they must have been feeling. Think about it. They were walking away from what was probably the most traumatic day of their lives. The gospel writer describes these two disciples as processing everything that had happened as they walked. But starting in verse 14, listen to what happens next. As they walked along, they were talking about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things, Jesus himself suddenly came up and began walking with them. But God kept them from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing so intently as you walk along?" They stopped short, sadness written across their faces. Then one of them, Cleopas, replied, "You must be the only person in Jerusalem who hasn't heard about all the things that have happened there the last few days." "What things?" Jesus asked. "The things that happened to Jesus, the man from Nazareth," they said. "He was a prophet who did powerful miracles, and he was a mighty teacher in the eyes of God and all the people. But our leading priests and other religious leaders handed him over to be condemned to death, and they crucified him. We had hoped he was the Messiah who had come to rescue Israel." There's so much that I've been pondering about this moment. One of the things that has stuck with me is that even when they were walking away from all the grief and trauma and pain that the previous days had held, Jesus walked with them. Even when they didn't realize it was him, even when they didn't feel him or see him or recognize his voice, he was there with them, listening and asking questions. But what I love about this passage is that even before they recognized Jesus, these two disciples were walking and processing all that had happened together. I've been learning that in order to endure the hard and painful things of life, we need each other. We need the kind of relationships that are slow and messy and true. We need the kind of relationships that plunge beneath pleasantries and good eye contact, who see all the worst parts of us and refuse to leave. We need people in our lives who stay in the awkwardness, linger in the discomfort, and lean into hard conversations. Because when those devastating moments of life come, and we can't feel God's presence or think that He's turned against us, these are the people who will embody Him to us. When we can't hear those invitational questions of Jesus, what are you discussing so intently as you walk along, and what things? We need people to be those question askers for us, inviting us to process, leaning in to listen. Today, while we cannot see Jesus physically with us, we can experience something of His real and tangible presence in the company of another. When we see the love and grief in the eyes of a brother or sister, when we see their tears, their heartache, and their compassion for us in our pain, we are able to more fully imagine the tears of Jesus, His weeping, His witness. And this sense of witness changes our experiences of suffering, because we know that whatever happens, we aren't alone in it. But going back to Luke 24, listen to what Jesus does next. Then Jesus took them through the writings of Moses and all the prophets, explaining from all the scriptures the things concerning Himself. By the time they were nearing Emmaus and near the end of their journey, Jesus acted as if He were going on, but they begged Him, "Stay the night with us since it's getting late." So He went home with them. As they sat down to eat, He took the bread and blessed it. Then He broke it and gave it to them. Suddenly their eyes were opened, and they recognized Him. As they walked and processed, Jesus began showing them the bigger story about Himself, about their pain, and about where all of this was going. He began giving them a belief system that was true, a meaning for their pain that held space for their grief and questions, while simultaneously helping them see beyond this present moment into all that was to come. And when they sat at a table and broke bread with Jesus, they realized it was Him that they had been talking to all along. Every single one of us has been invited to sit at a table with God in the middle of our pain. And I've been learning that truly, deeply sitting at this table requires honesty. Instead of numbing, we have to name. We have to enter into the ache of our experiences, and we have to process what we're actually thinking and feeling. We can't stuff our pain. We have to name it with Jesus and with each other. The Bible gives these honest cries of a hurting heart a name: lament. As author and psychiatrist Kurt Thompson describes, lament includes naming what is real about my life and how I feel towards God in the process, with all my longings and griefs, joys and rage, shame and confidence. This practice of lament allows us to sense God acknowledging our deepest places of alienation, our deepest places of loss, our deepest pain, and so come to experience God's love as even deeper than we could ever expect or experience it to be. The art of naming invites us back into a place of belonging in the bigger story that God is telling. It connects us back to our own hearts and to the heart of God, who weeps with us in our grief and pain, while simultaneously weaving our lives together in a way that we can't fully see, and in some way that I don't think I'll ever quite understand. Our souls begin to enlarge and expand as we find ourselves with a greater and greater capacity to hold both the brokenness and beauty of life, the joy and the grief, the laughter and the tears, the goodness and the pain. And we begin to see how, at the same time that God is healing us, He is also unleashing a healing work through us. And somehow, some way, that story that we would never choose becomes a story that rings of God's faithfulness, a powerful conduit that brings comfort and healing to others. A story that flows into the bigger story that God is telling with our lives and of this world. So to wrap up this episode, I wanted to end with a quick reflection on last week's episode. Last week, I shared about a time in my life that hasn't made sense, which involved an eating disorder diagnosis. If you're interested in listening, I've linked the episode in the show notes. This was my first time ever sharing more deeply about this struggle, and to be honest, I did not want to do it. Maybe more accurately, I was actively opposed to it. My battle with anorexia and recovery journey has held so much shame for me. So I did 2 beautiful interviews with different women on mental health instead. But because of some technological issues, I couldn't use either of the recordings. I had a week left in the series with no episode for it, and I sensed God inviting me to share my mental health journey instead. 2.5 months of hosting and listening to the women on this series share such painful stories with so much bravery gave me the courage to share mine. We need each other. We need each other's stories. That's how we find the courage to share our own. Before releasing that episode, I thought of about 45 reasons why not to, but I'm learning to name the hard parts of life, and I'm learning to trust that God is telling a bigger story than what you and I can see. Next week, we'll be starting a new series on the podcast, so make sure to go back and listen to any episodes in this series that you might have missed along the way. I think you're going to love what's coming up on the podcast. It's been so much fun to work on, so make sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Until next week. Thank you for joining me for today's episode. I'd love to hear from you. Connect with me on Instagram at TaylorJoy. If this conversation was helpful and you'd like more information about my other offerings to engage your story more deeply, check out my website, taylorjoymurray.co.